And just a little framing, I know that for a lot of the sessions that we do, we really want a lot of engagement, and being a former 7th grade math teacher, that's my go-to. I love when people talk, I love when people participate, but we really are hoping that this session will be primarily just me talking at you, so feel free to sit back and relax. And at the end, there will be time for questions. And as I'm talking through this, again, feel encouraged to type anything in the chat, and then we'll be able to have and answer those questions at the end. So if you'd like to, you can test the chat out. You can type in what it is that you're hoping to learn, or anything about your project that you're really trying to orient yourself towards as it relates to community engaged research. And then hopefully at the end, we'll answer some of those questions throughout the presentation, but also we can revisit any of them if they haven't been answered. So welcome everybody, and I'm excited to get started. And there's a little bit of a time delay too for the changing of the slides, so I apologize in advance. So this is our agenda for today. I'll share a little bit about who I am, which I know many of you know, and a little bit about some of our organizations, which again, I know a lot of you know. I'll ask some reflection questions, and again, you're welcome and encouraged to type any of your answers in the chat, but I won't be asking for any responses out loud at this time. We'll go through the what, so challenges, some challenges to collaboration. The why do community engaged research? What does it mean? Why is it important to break down silos? And some of the how, and I think this might get to some of the questions and some of the specifics that you all as students may be going through as you're conducting your community engaged research. And then as I mentioned, we'll go through some of the questions at the end, but again, feel free to type them in the chat as we go along and we can revisit them. So first, the who. Nyawa Skeno ni Giaso, Kristen Kazak, Onondawaga ni A. I'm Kristen Kazak. I am Seneca Hawk Clan from the Allegheny Territory. I'm very Polish. I went from a very Polish last name to another very Polish last name, as you'll see online. But this is a little bit about my background. For undergrad, I went to the University of Notre Dame. I did a lot of tutoring. I was participating a lot in our Native student organization. And the president actually joined this organization, which many of you may be familiar with, called Teach for America. She taught on her home reservation and really encouraged us to try to figure out ways that we might be able to connect with our tribes, nations, pueblos, communities around the U.S. So that's what I did. I taught for a few years, 7th grade math on the Laguna Pueblo. Some of you, I think, love statistics, love math, and I really tried to instill that in a lot of my students. So I appreciate when people are like really into developing survey questions and really interpreting data. So if you have any questions related to that, I would love talking about them. But then I also was able to get an MPA at Cornell. I got a master's in education from the University of New Mexico. And I did a couple of things. I worked with Teach for America's national organization on the Native Alliance Initiative. So trying to figure out how can we encourage people from our communities to teach there, to work there, to live there. And then I switched over to working with this organization called the Naca Inspired Schools Network, which was a network of Indigenous education experts and leaders. We worked with tribes, nations, and pueblos around the U.S., in New Mexico, South Dakota, Oklahoma, Hawaii, Colorado, and doing a few different things, transferring ownership from BIE, which is Bureau of Indian Education, to tribal grant schools. So really digging into self-determination for a lot of our different communities. And it's been interesting because about 2.5 years ago, I decided I missed Buffalo. I wanted to come home. And that's when I joined the organizations that many of you know, Partnership for the Public Good and the Cornell ILR Buffalo Collab, working on Buffalo Commons. But what really ties, I think, all of this together is the focus on community and really elevating the voices of community and community members and priorities. So I'm excited to talk about this, but if you have any questions about my background, I would love to talk through any of those and answer those as well. So again, I know many of you are familiar with PPG, Partnership for the Public Good. It's a community-based think tank that Buffalo Commons is co-located with, as well as Cornell University's ILR Buffalo CoLab. Again, some of you may know that Cornell has land-grant missions, particularly the ILR school. And what that really means and how I interpret it is that we really exist to try to serve our local community. And for Cornell, that means the folks around here. So New York State residents, and particularly for extension offices, folks here in Buffalo. We try to connect it to New York State issues. We try to connect New York State issues to issues around the nation, but really trying to lift up and elevate the voices here locally, because that's a really important thing to do. Many of you are participating in the High Road building blocks. You do a little bit of an introduction to the organizations that you're working with. Again, thinking about what are the important things for community research. You talk about the history, which I think is also really important. What exists now doesn't exist outside of history. So it's really important to understand the context of both the people and the organizations that you're working with. There's a lot of different forces that contribute to what's going on right now. They could be nationally influenced or locally influenced, so getting a good handle on what that is and means. I know many of you are participating in a summer program. There's a limited amount of time, but really trying to understand that is part of the work, and it's really important, and it's a tool and skill that you can use in a lot of the work that you'll be doing henceforth. And then I think one of the two really important things are the critical reflection. I know this is integrated in a lot of your different programs, but really thinking about both yourself and how you fit into what it is that your organization is doing. And I think those are two really important components. Related to that are the narrative and storytelling. So it isn't just you exist in a vacuum and you're an objective participant in whatever it is that's going on. You come with your own biases and narratives and backgrounds that influence how you work and how you interact with those around you. And many times it's really helpful. And I know you guys are doing really amazing work. But continual reflection and narrative and storytelling are just elements that I would really highly encourage you to think about as you're going through your projects in your summer. So just a couple of reflection questions. And again, you're just going to take a couple of minutes to think about these as it relates to you, your work, your projects, your life. Doesn't have to be specific to this summer, but these are just some of the things that we ask a lot from our institutions of higher education and some of our community partners. Again, you're encouraged to type anything in the chat if you have thoughts that you want to reflect to other people. So what does community mean to you in your work? What does knowledge mean to you in your work? Who are the experts in your work? So now we're going to dig into the what. So what is community engaged research? Or more specifically, what are some of the challenges to collaborating? Because the first step in community engaged research is figuring out these elements of collaboration. So first, I wanted to lay out sort of the picture that we often see in our communities and nationally. So we kind of work and operate in these silos of government and elected officials. There's this type of stakeholder and they interact, and they kind of have their own systems and institutions and sets of rules. Then there's another silo of universities and academic institutions. There's faculty and staff and students and grad students and PhD and undergrad. And oftentimes they work and operate with different rules and different timelines and different systems. And then there's this other silo or bucket of community members, organizations, labor unions, folks who are doing mutual aid. and their timelines and their expectations and their systems and rules are often different than the previous two. So just thinking about, this is kind of a challenge that government experiences, universities experience, and communities experience as they're living and navigating in the world with sometimes these different operating systems and rules. So why don't community organizations always or often work with institutions or government? So many of you may be familiar with this, and I'll give some examples from my background, which is why I shared a little bit about it. But sometimes they've been burned before. So these are two actual things that have happened with some of the organizations that I worked with. So people came into our school, they surveyed our students, and then we never saw the result or the product of what it is that they got our information from. For my second job, people came in, they surveyed our schools, but they framed them in the sort of poverty narrative that wasn't asset-based. That was the way that we tried to frame what it is that we're doing. So ultimately, one of our community members actually saw the results of the study and said, this isn't how I wanted this to be interpreted. Why are they talking about this? I thought those people were so nice coming in and working with our schools and our communities. Why are they talking about us like this? So we kind of frame that in the sense of, a lot of times communities have been burned before. So thinking about your role and reflecting on, maybe this has happened with the community that you're working with right now. It's not your fault. You are likely very well intended, but approaching communities and community members with the humility of and understanding that this has likely happened to many of them. And how can you think about you and your work and your approaches a little bit differently so that they understand this is not what you're going for, that what you do hope to do is to share back some information with them in a way that's appropriate and that really reflects their values. Sometimes the institutions or government can wrongly classify or categorize people. So again, for example, I worked with a lot of indigenous communities, and still to this day, you look in the newspaper or you look in government reports or a lot of different academic journal articles, and we're kind of grouped in the other category. So we don't really get a sense or understanding of, well, what does it mean for our community? And what does it mean for folks who live on a reservation or live and work in urban Indian communities? So as you think through your work, how can you make sure that you reflect the different populations that you're working with? So similarly, it leaves out some of the nuances. So if you're doing interviews or if you're doing surveys, you might want to generalize or establish some large takeaways. But if you do that without qualifying it with some nuances, it might be a little troublesome. So for example, you might want to say, well, there's a high prevalence of diabetes in Indian country. That's an accurate statement, but what are some of the nuances related to that? What is some of the historical information that may have caused some of this? What are some of the contemporary things that lead up to this? And again, thinking about, well, comparisons with other groups, are there similarities or differences that cause these disparities? So thinking about some of the nuances that you can pull out as you're doing this research is really important. And then again, and I don't know how you all have experienced this yet this summer, but a lot of times community organizations are really responding to immediate needs of community members. So they might not have time. They would love to have these longer term goals, or they would love to answer these questions. And it's not that they aren't well intended, it's that they're literally trying to get food on the table for the people that they're working with, or they're really trying to respond to try to get water reestablished in the houses for the people that they're working with. So again, thinking about some of the reasons helps you as you're developing your plans and as you're thinking through your experiences and expectations. So there's also a lot of different reasons why institutions, like institutions of higher education, can't really work well with community partners or government. So sometimes they have different timelines. So thinking about you, if you're a student, you have somewhat limited amount of time. You had a pre-course leading up to your experience, and then you have 8 weeks this summer to do your project. So thinking about, well, community organizations operate on different fiscal years, they have different deadlines, and so sometimes the timelines don't always match up. So as you're reflecting and thinking about your project, how are those timelines different, and how can you figure out ways to make sure that they're responsive to your community partners? So there's a lot of different, and I have tenure here, so that's a lot more for faculty, but for students, it could be more for your course. So what are the requirements for your course? There's likely certain things that you have to accomplish, and maybe they don't exactly align with what your community partner needs at that time. So if that's the case, it's really important to communicate both with the community partner and with the institution. How are these different, and how can you potentially reconcile some of them? As you all well know, working in this virtual space, it's hard for you all to get places. Sometimes community partners have events and they would love people to just be there and meet some of their constituents. But you're working around the country, or you might not have access to transportation, so it might be a little bit difficult for that to happen. Sometimes there's a research question that you're really interested in, or that like you're really passionate about, and maybe it doesn't exactly align with what the community partner wants or needs. That's okay. I think there are ways to do both, where you can establish what it is that you're really interested in and figure out ways to research what it is that you want to learn, while also pursuing whatever project the community partner is looking for. And then it takes time to build relationships. As you all well know, especially in these virtual spaces, it's really hard to build relationships. So it's important sometimes to go out of your way to really listen to people. And I know I've heard a lot of you reflect that in some of your critical reflection time and on Fridays, but really thinking about what does it mean to build a relationship, and why is that important, even if you do have a limited amount of time that you're spending with community partners. And why don't community groups and institutions always work with government? I used to have like no one trusts the government on this slide, but some people got like really offended. So it just takes a while to navigate bureaucracy. I think I heard a couple people talk about some of the government documents that they have been reading through and how long they are, and the legalese and the different type of language that's used in them necessarily. And you oftentimes have to check with a layer of people. So it isn't just enough to get approval from one person, you actually have to get approval from their manager or someone who supervises them. Or if you're looking for information, and this is a whole other session, the government should provide it, but sometimes you would have to do something like file a FOIL request, which we have a lot of information about on our website. And I know a lot of you, I think one of the previous speakers had talked a little bit about that. So there's a lot of bureaucracy and red tape to navigate when it comes to the government. There's also politics. So I think we're all pretty familiar with this on a national level, potentially on our local levels. It has nothing to do with what is or isn't allowed. It just has to do with what people think and how they're perceived and what relationships they have with each other. And sometimes they don't want to give information if they think it might make them look bad. So politics is a whole other story. I know a lot of you are majoring in that, but politics can be sometimes what inhibits community groups from being able to work and accomplish things. Their timelines are different. So thinking about different fiscal years, thinking about institutions of higher education. I'll give an example of, for our Bureau of Indian Education schools, one of the windows in the classroom was broken, and we had to file maybe like six different forms, fill them out, send them to the federal government, and it took about 6 months to replace, which is a crazy thing, but their timelines are different, their systems are different, again, their rules are different, so it might not align with community partners or other work. they might be looking for a specific solution. Again, it could relate back to politics, or it could relate to something else. So they might want, for example, if they're looking for ways to improve the environment, well, are they going to encourage biking, or are they going to invest in greener buses or establish more trains? So they're different specific solutions that might not align with what community groups or institutions of higher education really want to look into, investigate, or advocate for. And I think this is the case with every single one of these things that I just mentioned, but there's always the excuse or idea that there's no money anywhere to do anything. And I think that's particularly the case a lot with government, because it does cost a lot for a lot of things to happen. So the why. So why would we even do community engaged research if there's all these challenges? So I'll take a step back a little bit and share a little bit about Buffalo Commons, because I think this is one of the things that we seized an opportunity here in Buffalo, and I think there's a lot of potential in different niches and pockets where it exists across the country. What if we could get all of these different institutions to talk to each other and work with each other in meaningful ways? And I say Buffalo Commons does this, but I also think that, for example, Cornell has Engaged Cornell, which really encourages this community engaged research. UB has recently established in the last 5 years several different departments that really encourage this community engagement. Now, one of the things that they're always asking is, well, how can we do this and do this better? We don't have all the answers. They don't have all the answers, but I think there's a lot of lessons that I'll share in a little bit, as well as the student tips that I think we can learn from and we can grow from. So for Buffalo Commons, we're really trying to establish a public commons for collective knowledge sharing, impactful applied research, and public policy development. And I say a public commons because I think this is what differentiates us a little bit from some specific institutions of higher education or commons that governments will establish, because we really are trying to make it available to everyone, which I think is a great ideal, but not always happening in practice. We have a digital library, and I think, again, for a lot of the work that you do, and I say this right now because as you're thinking about you and your projects, you might be able to or want to put something out into the public, as long as your community partner agrees with it, that could be made available to the community. You're doing all of this work alongside your community partner. Why not make it available to everybody else so that they don't have to reinvent any wheels or spend any additional money or put any additional man or woman or other power into figuring out what it is that they're trying to do if you've already done it. So that's one of the things that we try to work with people, students and faculty and people in government and people in community organizations, to say, how do we get this knowledge out into the public so that we can collectively pool our resources so that we can push different policies and advance our, at least local community. And this is like a really intense image. I'm not gonna go through it all, but I think the point is, and many of you may have seen this already, that there's increasing level of community involvement impacts trust and communication. This is really helpful for a lot of longer term projects. And I think it's a little bit less likely that you can get to the shared leadership in the shorter term. But I think seeing the end goal is really helpful and really important. So thinking about your project, thinking about community engaged research, so maybe it has some community involvement, or you're kind of doing your work and the community partner's doing their work. You kind of like interact with each other a little bit. I know that's not how a lot of your projects are, but how do you move along this sort of trajectory so that you can get towards this shared leadership? And I'll go over some of these specifics too. But this is sort of a continuum that I think is really helpful, that we share a lot with the folks that we work with, who are faculty, staff, and students in our projects. And we also share it with our community partners so that they understand what and how we can all collaborate together and towards a greater understanding. So the how. So I broke this down into 2 sections and I swapped them. Usually talk about lessons learned, citing our own humility and saying that we didn't get it all right the first time, every time we've done it. But I put those closer to the end in case anyone had to hop off. So I'm gonna go through some specifics for students that we've gotten a lot with some of the students that we've worked with in the past. Grad students, PhD students, undergrad students, and we grouped them into different buckets. So for example, this is the project management tips. How do you manage a project? Again, for many of you, it's only 8 weeks long. So how do you think about how to do this really well? So first, I would say know your timeline and your partner's timeline. So thinking about some of the challenges, again, maybe you have 8 weeks, or maybe you're like, after this 8 weeks, I want to do some really cool research because I'm really into this. And maybe I can work with my partner to figure out a way that we could publish something publicly. Or maybe that's not at all what you want. That's totally fine. But figuring out your timeline is going to be really important. So it's like backwards planning. So what are you backwards planning? Well, what is the goal, outcome, or product? I think a lot of people can talk about, I'm working on this, these are the cool things that I'm doing, but is it clear between you and the community partner that you're working with what actually you're trying to produce? Is it a lit review for them? Is it a set of guidelines? Is it an outline for a program that they're doing? I think getting really clear about the product, again, ahead of time or as far ahead of time as you can is really important. Related to the product are the audiences. And I think this is a little bit different, and this is where a lot of people struggle because they're like, I'm just gonna do this. And the partner maybe wanted it to be more external facing, but you created it a little bit more internal facing, or just the opposite. They just wanted it to be for them, and you were hoping to put it out there and make it public. So being really clear about who your intended audience is really important. And if you're able to do this backwards plan, it really helps you to say no or yes to things. I do this as a working adult. I think this is one of the most helpful pieces of information anyone has ever shared with me. But if it's clear what goals you have, you can say no or yes to things while being flexible and being accommodating and trying to learn a lot of things. But really understanding what time you have in order to accomplish the big goal that you're trying to accomplish. So you can say, yes, this actually aligns with what we're trying to accomplish, or no, this doesn't really align, and maybe I can like sit on this Zoom call and listen passively while I do some research. So these are just some options you have when you're able to backwards plan. You can establish appropriately spaced mid-sized goals. I kept that pretty vague because I think for you all, for High Road students, for 8 weeks, you can set weekly goals, or you can set goals in the middle of the week, and then when, say, by the end of the week, you want to accomplish X, Y, or Z. And then I think it's important to communicate these goals. So communicate them with someone. Communicating them helps to hold you accountable, but it also helps your community partner to understand what it is that you're working on. What are you trying to accomplish that week? Have you done that? Are there ways that they can help or assist you in doing that? So really communicating is part of that relationship building that we had talked about. So determine tools and resources needed and where to find them. So it isn't just saying, okay, well, I need this data set. That's really important for me in order to figure out my research. Or I need to talk to this person. Do you have their contact information? Is there someone you need to reach out to in order to get it? So it's really figuring out not just what are the tools and resources needed, but where can you find that information so that it doesn't hold you up in moving forward with your project. And I linked something at the bottom of this, and again, I'll share all the links after this as well. But there's this really short book. It is written by an older white man, and I say that just to say that not all of our communities or not everyone might align with everything that is shared in this, but I do think he has some helpful tips in trying to accomplish certain tasks. So if you're someone who was like me about 15 years ago, who could be pulled in a million different directions, I highly recommend both this book, and it's really short, and there's a website that goes through a lot of the different tips. But some of the examples are to establish next step tasks. So really breaking down what is my next step. So not just saying, well, I need to interview this person, but saying I need to find this person's email, then I need to email them, then I need to establish the questions, then I need to reach out to them again, then I need to confirm a date, and then I need to interview them. So really breaking down some of your next step tasks, and again, communicating them and reevaluating them. So I'll share that in a follow-up email and also in the chat later too. So correspondence tips, and I apologize, I did orient this one more towards email than phone calls, but I can definitely help answer questions if it relates to phone calls, and I think some of these are pretty applicable too. So first, introduce yourself, little bit about your background, like who is this person calling me? What project are they working on? If it's possible in your email without making it too long, are there additional questions that you're hoping that the person would answer that you can include in there? If applicable, just mention how you got their information. Sometimes it's really helpful for me when someone reaches out to me and said, oh, this person from Buff State recommended that I reach out to you. So I'm like, oh, okay, I know this person. I kind of know what they work on. So maybe this person is reaching out as it relates to something that person from Buff State really wanted to do. So trying to figure out, just establishing in maybe 1.5 sentences, all of that. I know it's a lot to contain. Making it brief, but keeping the important information. As you see from my slides, I'm not great at keeping things brief. I like to share everything. I think everything is important. So I usually put whatever I give to somebody else so that they can reduce it and say, this is a little redundant, this isn't necessary. So really trying to make it brief. And again, going back to some of the challenges, a lot of people don't have a lot of time. So if you can help them in wanting to respond to your email or your questions by making them as brief as you possibly can, that's going to be really helpful in having them be able to get back to you. One of the really important things, and again, going back to the reflection questions about who is the expert. So again, this is less applicable, I think, to you all since you've done a lot of reflection in the pre-course around this, but sometimes folks at institutions of higher education might say, well, I have a degree in this, I'm a real expert in this, I've been studying this for such a long time. But really, you're reaching out to someone because they're an expert on something. So try to defer to their expertise and say, I hear that you are an expert in school food, and I would really love to talk to you about X, Y, or Z, and defer to their time. So I know you all are busy, but try to imagine other people being busy too. But if you need a response by a certain date, give them a certain date. And again, this is, I think, more applicable for emails. And if you schedule a meeting, it's really, really helpful to propose a few specific dates and times. So don't just say, hey, in the next few weeks, would you like to sit down for an interview? Again, which is something I used to do because I was deferring to their time. Saying, hey, in the next few weeks, I'm available on Thursday between 2 to 4. Put your time zone, depending on your time zone, so that people aren't confused. In order to confirm things, I found it really helpful. If it's Thursday, the 18th, put Thursday, 6/18, so that there's no confusion about any of the dates and times that you're trying to propose. And then finally, if you don't hear back within a few days, really try to follow up politely. I try to do this in my work. I have to put reminders on my calendar because sometimes if I send an email out into the ether, I could completely forget about it. So I'll put a reminder to send a follow-up if I haven't heard from someone yet, just to make sure, especially if it's really important for the project, that I do follow up. And you could say, like, I know this is busy, or if you know something about their organization, what they've been doing in the last few days, you can say, I see that push has been inundated with donations because of Mark Ruffalo, you know, how can you defer to it and let them know that they're working hard, but that you would love a response to your email. So I'm going to try to fly through this because I know we're running out of time. Some interview tips. So how do you do interviews? What is a good interview? And again, I've done a lot of interviews for my past projects. We do them for these ones. But some tips before the interview, again, introduce yourself, the project, and what is the goal of the interview? Are you trying to write something? Are you trying to get quotes? Be clear about what that goal is, and then ask or receive permission for use of the information. Do you need it written? Do you need them to sign off on anything? Like I had said before, I'm recording this, so I didn't really ask your permission, but I did warn you that I will be recording it. So making sure you're mindful of some of those things. Create an outline and questions for your time together. This is really important, again, because I know some people who are like, I can just wing it. This is great. I'll think of questions on the fly. And then you get to the interview and you're like, is that really what you want to ask? Related to this is that it is really, 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 I think, important and helpful to send the outlining questions ahead of time to people, to give them a chance to reflect. Maybe they want to jot some things down. I know I don't always give the most articulate responses as someone's asking me questions on the fly. So helping them to be able to get time to reflect and do those things is really important. And maybe there's some questions that they could think of for you to incorporate in the interview that would be really helpful in completing your goals. And write yourself a script. So it sounds silly, but write your introduction, or else maybe you could go on for 20 minutes introducing yourself before you get to any of the questions for the person you're interviewing. During the interview, you can welcome them. I know this is a little different. Probably won't offer them water, but if you're on Zoom, you can make sure that they have a water available, or make them comfortable in any way possible. Get to know them a little. They're just humans, you're just humans. Sometimes people are a little intimidated by interviews, but just making them as comfortable as possible is really important. Give them time to answer. Don't just expect something. Maybe they didn't have a chance to go through your questions. Ask follow-up questions as if it's a conversation. Don't just rigidly go through things. If they say something that relates to you, like, acknowledge it, or you can follow it up with a few different comments. Really try to treat it a little bit like a conversation. And if it's a potentially sensitive question, just confirm before asking it. And I think this is something we see and hear a lot, particularly with a lot of our government partners. After the interview, really make sure to send a follow-up thank you as soon as possible. It's kind of like when you go to an interview, even if you're conducting one, just send a thank you as soon as possible. And then eventually, just confirm any quotes or takeaway for feedback. You kind of don't, again, if you're doing community engaged research, you don't want to get anyone in a gotcha moment. That doesn't feel right. That doesn't feel comfortable. So make sure you send them any quotes or takeaways for any potential feedback. And then I think some of you are conducting surveys. So I got 2 slides for surveys. There's probably a million other tips that we could give. But again, going back to establishing the goal for the survey. And I would say goals for each of the questions. We just established several surveys this year for nonprofits. And we bulleted out like, oh, we want information about their revenue. Oh, we want information about this. We want information about that. And then we went and developed the questions for it. But some of the questions we were like, those are redundant, or this actually doesn't answer what it is we're trying to get at. Do we need it, or is there a better way that we can ask it? So figuring out the goals both for the survey and for each of the questions, and then reflecting on whether or not you accomplish those as you're developing them. Communicating the goal to participants. So I get these questions all the time. Hey, participate in our survey. It's about food. And I'm like, okay, well, what about food? What is this information going to be used for? Like, will it be made publicly available to me at any point? If there are answers to those questions, try to figure out, again, brief ways of introducing them to the people that'll participate in the surveys. Determine ideal and realistic number of participants. So those of you who took statistics, how many people, what is sort of the big population that you're looking at, or what is a sufficient number of responses that you could receive that would allow you to do takeaways while also getting all the information that you need. How will you have people participate? Is it online? Is it in person? Is it both? Will the way that people participate change the way that they respond to questions? And if so, like, does that matter? So really reflecting on that too. Think through different categories of people and who or how they might be represented. So for example, we worked in schools. An elementary teacher would have a lot different answers than some of our high school teachers. The elementary teachers, both for the level of student and for the subjects. So sometimes people teach different subjects, sometimes they teach multiple subjects, but also if you're a woman who's a teacher versus if you identify in a different way, like how is that going to impact the way that you answer these questions? If you identify as Black or African American, or you identify as multiracial, or if you identify as white, is that going to impact how you answer these questions? And if it is, then how can you make sure to get representative voices in the survey that you're going to send out to people? Keep it short, the number of questions and the types of responses. And again, I can go through this and I'll be sending some links too. Make them Likert scales. So it's usually like strongly agree or strongly disagree, and it could be 5 or 7 different options in between, or give options when possible. So we made the mistake for some of our school surveys at first, because we wanted people just to type in whatever they thought, and it took us, well, it took us so many days to sort through these responses, but it also wasn't very helpful for us to draw conclusions because people said so many different things. So give options when possible. If you're asking for, well, what are the best ways that we could reach out to you? Put email, phone, posters, libraries, give people options so that they can self-identify, and allow them, if it's helpful for you, to do multiple responses. Survey tips 2, start with the simplest questions. You don't want to dive into something like really deep and really hard to answer, or people might just opt out of it. If possible, only include 1 to 3. Again, it really depends on your survey. I've done surveys with like 6 or 7 just because the survey itself had to be longer. Open-ended questions where people can type in any responses they want. Consider or allow people to opt out of a question if it really isn't necessary. I think that sometimes gets people hung up and then they just quit the survey altogether. Avoid any bias or leading questions. I think this is one of the things that we're all most mindful of, but it's really just one element of creating a survey. Avoid using absolutes like always or never. I hate those questions personally. And I think there's a lot of surveys that ask those, and I'm like, well, it's really hard for me to answer this, so I'm just gonna not take your survey. Test and preview survey yourself and with a few people for feedback. You guys are all cohorts, or there's a lot of people who are working with you that I'm sure would be happy to just click through some of the questions. I even send it to my family sometimes just because they want to know what we're working on, or they're really interested, and they like to give candid feedback. So I highly encourage you to find a couple people, if you are doing a survey, who might be able to test it ahead of time. And then again, thank participants for their time. Let them know how they can find what their answers will be used for. I think that's really important. If they won't be publicly available, I think that's fine. Just tell them what the project is and what they're trying to accomplish. And then if possible, and again, this is probably limited for what's able to happen this summer, consider some sort of incentive. So if there's any sort of giveaway, or if there's anything that they could get for taking the survey. So those are just some of the categories for specific things that students have asked us about. But I wanted to go into some of our lessons learned really quick. And then I'll wrap up, and I think we might have about 5 minutes for questions, but I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer to try to answer them. So what are some of the lessons that we've learned working with our community partners, which I think you have heard throughout this conversation? Be clear about purposes or goals, both with your community partners and any community members that you're working with. Become knowledgeable about your community and your experiences. So again, thinking back to my work with our tribes, nations, pueblos, what are some of the experiences that they've had with researchers coming in? Thinking about Buffalo, what are some of the experiences that they've had with different institutions of higher education or different government partners? And how might that impact how they interact with you or others, or even other groups? Go to the community, establish relationships, build trust, again, as much as possible with the limited time and space that I know exists. Work with formal and informal leadership. And we didn't really talk about this a lot, but sometimes you want to talk to the most important person with the fanciest title, but really it's someone else. For a lot of our tribal communities, it could be our elders, and maybe they don't have fancy titles, but they know the most. So figuring out if you're doing maybe power mapping, who holds the formal power, but there also might be other people who hold informal power, and thinking through some of that. Share any resources. Again, this might be limited for what happens this summer, but if there's tangible resources, if there's resources that you think could be helpful for your community partner that you just stumble upon, just share them. They could ignore them, they could use them, but it's sometimes really helpful. Ongoing communication and feedback opportunities. So sometimes, as you heard, a lot of times people like to do their research and then get feedback from community, or work with the community and then not get any feedback. So really establishing, as you project manage your timeline, how are you going to incorporate feedback opportunities within that? Respect time and pay people for their time if possible. Maybe you don't want to schedule a 2-hour meeting. Maybe you want to see if it could be cut down to 30 minutes or maybe an hour, but just really trying to be mindful of people's time. Seek approval before going public. Again, thinking about your personal community engaged research or any of the projects that you're doing. Maybe some community partners are totally cool with you publishing something or putting something on the commons, but make sure you get that approval from multiple people in the organization before doing that. And I think one of the really important things is to share credit. I think this isn't something that happens a lot, particularly in higher ed, and I don't think a lot in government, but really acknowledging, like, we worked with this community partner and these people specifically at this community partner. And it could be in like a forward part of your research, again, if you're publishing it formally, or if you're doing a presentation, talking through how other people have helped you with your project. Redefining who has knowledge and who counts as experts. And I say this specifically as it relates to your community project and your engaged research, but then I think it's also important to reiterate this and repeat this in the conversations that you're having. I know I've heard a lot of you say this too, but I think that's a really important thing to emphasize, is that these are experts in lived experiences within their own communities, and many times people have been in this work for decades. So really acknowledging that expertise is really important. Communities really want and need to learn knowledge, skills, and tools as much as anyone else. So if you're like, I found this really cool thing or really cool resource, it's important, and I think it's the prerogative of a researcher to say, it isn't just for your own personal knowledge, but really to try to pass that on in any way or capacity to your community or to your community partner. So is it a training? Is it a toolkit? Is it something else? Long-term, not just project-based relationships. This might be limited, but if it's possible, 6 months from now, if you see something cool in the news, just like sending an email to someone. I still get some things from this is, I don't know, 17 years ago when I was an undergrad, doing internships in Montana. But I think those are really important things, just to reiterate that This is about relationships. We're building a community who really cares about each other. I don't know if you guys need this, but you could develop an MOU or an MOA, especially if it's not really clear what the timeline or what the project result is. You can just do a quick one. It doesn't have to be too formal. Acknowledge assets alongside challenges. Again, thinking about some of our experiences with some of my students. They didn't just want to have all these challenges. They wanted to talk about some really amazing things that their community had been doing. So making sure that we acknowledge those assets while also acknowledging that there are challenges. You don't want to ignore those either. Understanding that communities are diverse. And I say that because a lot of times people, again, I can only speak to my own experience, but people want to group you into one category. So for example, in our indigenous or native communities, they say native people versus my friends who live in Alaska have a lot of different experiences than my friends who live in the Pueblos in New Mexico, then have different experiences than us and some of my family and friends who live up here in the East Coast. So not just grouping everyone into categories. One thing that I know that I've heard a lot from, and even in our own work at PBG, is do I use Black or African American? Like, it's important to ask these questions, and you can ask them of your community partner. What does your organization usually do? How do you usually frame this? Because our communities are diverse, and you really want to acknowledge that in the research that you're doing. And then consider and integrate cultural norms and expectations. I don't know how many of you have been part of tribal councils, but sometimes they take a really long time, and they might not get to you in the agenda. But that might be the case for our organizations that we're working with. Do people do check-ins before they launch into a meeting? Do they do introductions? What are some of the, they could be formal or informal norms and expectations that your community partner or the group that you're going to be interviewing or working with really defer to as you're thinking about doing your community engaged research, and try to integrate those into the work that you're doing. So we like to end on sort of a positive note. We're trying to build a shared vision for us, for Buffalo Commons. It's for our region here in Western New York, but also across New York State, and hopefully nationally, we will be able to inspire some folks. But I think it's important to keep the ultimate end goal in mind. We talked about the specifics of your project, but thinking about this as a community that has existed here for a very long time and will continue to exist. So it's really important to figure out what this shared vision and how the work that you're doing contributes to it. So I said I would save about 5 minutes at the end. Again, I apologize, this is not my usual style, but we wanted to be able to record this for folks who weren't able to attend. But what questions do you all have? Were there additional skills or tools that you think would be helpful for us to go over or go through or include in this presentation? Or are there examples where things have worked really well, or examples where they did not work really well? We're always looking for those to share with each other, but then also with some of the partners that we have as well. So you're welcome to unmute yourself, or I'll be looking through the chat box right now. Or any random questions you might have. They might not be these specific ones. And I'll stop recording.